All right, let's talk today about, is the affix bolstering actually salvageable? So on the reset, I made a video talking about, this week in Mythic Plus, and we kind of talked about bolstering, kind of the implications of what was going to happen with bolstering. And there's been actually a decent amount of negative community feedback and negative community sentiment among the affix. And I think now is probably a good time to talk about, is the affix really salvageable? Is it one that can actually be reworked in the World Within to probably be something that's a bit better or a bit more well-rounded with just how affixes are currently performing? Blizzard has stated a couple of times at this point now that they want you to be focusing a lot more on the dungeons and a lot less on the affixes. I think by and large they've done an okay job at this. There are some exceptions. I think that Raging is maybe in a little bit of a weird spot where there is some counterplay, but there's not a ton of counterplay. And a lot of people actually have experiences like you're seeing on screen right here, where you're trying to play a dungeon of this week's set, and you go into Everbloom, and you bolster up the Abomination, and it does Noxus Eruption with 4 stacks because you have Dread Petals in the pool, and the Dread Petals have 30% of the HP of the Abominations, and then you get farmed by the pack until bolstering eventually falls off, and then you are able to farm the pack. Same thing happens in Darkheart Thicket with the Grizzlies. I've seen some stuff happen in Waycrest Manor with Matron Alma. That's in front of Soulbound Goliath. I think that Everbloom is probably the worst offender of bolstering this season, but I think that bolstering with this dungeon set is not great, especially with how it currently works. Now, from Blizzard's perspective, they have nerfed it a few times, and they've tried to get this on-death affix into a state where it is less about the affix and it is more about the dungeon. And there is a question as to whether or not players are going to complain about the worst affix almost uniformly. Or is this something that, regardless of what was actually said about the affix itself, would JB still be tweeting about the worst affix? If it was incorporeal, would Blizzard say something? Would JB be tweeting about incorporeal? Because right now he's saying, I think Blizzard would be a lot less inclined to keep bolstering around if they had to deal with similar stuff in their lives. Like, each person at your morning standard meeting took 20% longer than the person before them, and I bet bolstering is gone before the end of this week. Now, they have done actually a couple of good things with bolstering over time. Like, bolstering no longer increases the health of affected enemies. This was a change that happened coming into 10.1. It was one that the community was kind of talking about for a while that needed to change with bolstering. It was previously health and damage. In addition to that, in 9.1.5, bolstering was created to temporarily be on the mobs for 20 seconds when it was previously infinite. And so that was actually a pretty good change. And on top of that, yeah, it just was added to have a duration. I've looked back through the changelog on bolstering on Wowhead, and there's a lot that's changed with it. So I remember when it got nerfed from 45 yards to 30 yards, allowing you to CC mobs and just kind of move away from them before, just to make sure that the mobs didn't get bolstered. And that was a strategy for a while where you would have like one mob in a pack that you would CC, and then you would play it solo to make sure it didn't get bolstered. And that was a strat that was implemented for a while, but then players eventually, bolstering has been changed a lot. And credit to Blizzard for doing this. Bolstering has been changed a lot to where it's not like the world's largest time loss on paper, right? Like, the mobs aren't gaining HP whenever you mess up bolster killing them, but it still is a massive time loss. And I think that there are reasons that it's a time loss, and let's kind of talk about a couple of them. First and foremost, it requires you to kind of reroute a dungeon. If we go back to Everbloom, this area, I've seen a lot of people basically stop pulling Dread Petals because of this, and instead they're having to pull basically every other mob in the dungeon. And this is something that's a bit awkward for players, especially players who don't play a ton. Now, for players like myself who play pretty much every week, almost regardless of what we're doing, it's probably fine. We're going to reroute around the dungeon. Bolstering is the hardest affix, but that's maybe something that's salvageable, right? Whenever you're talking about, is bolstering savable? If it's the hardest affix, it probably could just be nerfed to be savable, right? Where you don't have weird interactions where lieutenant mobs like this Abomination and stuff like that actually get affected by bolstering or something weird of the sort. They're actually, and to Blizzard's credit as well, they normally go and try to impact the mobs that are doing on-death affixes and make them a little bit less problematic. Like the Dread Petals, I'm surprised that they do on-death affixes. I think is one that's a bit shocking, but Blizzard more often than not is kind of fine at that. Now, the reason that it's so hard and so annoying is because you have to reroute the key every single week if once bolstering shows back up. And so for like Everbloom, you play a lot fewer dread petals, and instead you're going to be maybe gnarl roots on the table. I'm not saying necessarily that it is, but it could potentially be. And that's just functionally with how bolstering works. It's going to be something that you're going to see is that, like gnarl root might be on the table. You might have to slow pull the Waycrest Manor Courtyard instead of doing the dogs with a trash pack. Instead, you were doing the dogs solo. Or instead of doing Matron Alma with the dogs, you have the tank taunt Matron Alma, and somebody then taunts the dogs off of the tank and takes them 35 yards or 30 yards away to make sure that they don't bolster them off. And then you have your 4-man group just kind of tanking these 2 dogs to make sure they're not bolstering Matron Alma so they don't kill your tank. So stuff like that. Those are the reasons that it's like a time loss, right? It's not a time loss in the sense of it's adding HP to the dungeon, but it's a time loss in the sense of how you're playing the dungeon is almost antithetical on bolstering to how you play it on any other week. And that, to me, is problematic. I think that to most players, I think that simplifying the process would probably be a little bit easier, right? Where it's not changing so drastically from week to week from affix to affix. And I think that that's something that Blizzard has done a pretty good job of. But I think that bolstering is still a relic of the past in that regard. I personally do not think that bolstering is savable in this dungeon set. I think that this dungeon set is probably... I do not think that they could have designed a worse set of dungeons for bolstering ever. Like this, the way that bolstering works with these mobs is, and how you're pulling a lot of these trash packs is very bad. There are a lot of packs that have like pretty low HP mobs mixed in with high HP mobs, and I think it's just a situation that Blizzard can very rarely actually have a victory whenever they're trying to design interesting dungeons, and they have to think about what bolstering's implication is for every single situation. Yeah, so I think that bolstering is probably not personally. I think it's probably not savable, and I think that it's kind of been proven that players are. If you look at Season 1, you see that big decline in Mythic Plus runs and that spike back up. This is due to like a tyrannical bolstering week from memory, where players have proven time and time again that they're not necessarily willing to play bad affix weeks, right? And the amount of players that are going to be playing bad affix weeks is going to sharply decline. I'm very interested in seeing what the stats are about to look like for week 5 here, once we have bolstering finished, because Mythic Plus has been in a very healthy state, and we're actually having more and more completions of Mythic Plus than even in Season 1, which is surprising because Season 1 is typically when people start playing the game, right? And so the fact that we've had this many runs being done is a very positive sign of a very healthy Mythic Plus game. And that's great. And I think that's awesome. However, whenever people then see bolstering and they're like, this isn't fun, I'm not willing to play this, that's a problem. And I think that like raging is hard, right? Raging was hard. And I think that if you don't have an evoker, it's challenging. Raging Storming was kind of annoying, but at the same point, there's counterplay, right? So first off, you can bring an evoker. Secondly, you can kind of just make sure that whenever mobs are about to rage, you can do something about it. And I think that this is the thing that bolstering lacks the most, is that for a lot of situations, the counterplay is to either not have pulled that pack, rerouted the dungeon in a different manner, or done something completely different with the key, or maybe in some instances not even zoned into that dungeon. And I think that feels a bit weird whenever there's little to no counterplay for the bolstering affix, and it feels really bad whenever there's a mob that's like super high priority in a dungeon, and then the mobs around it, like once you kill that mob off, then those mobs get bolstered up, and like that feels a bit weird. Or mobs like the Colossus and a Taldazar, like instead of... Okay, so the Colossus has about 50% more HP than the mobs surrounding it. Are you supposed to single target down the Colossus and then AoE the trash around it? That just seems so inefficient, and it seems like the polar opposite of how you're supposed to be playing bolstering. So while I do think it's great that Blizzard has been nerfing bolstering over time, I think that this affix is probably in a state where it needs to be sunsetted coming into War Within. I think it's probably an affix that needs to go. I think that if they're looking to rework it, I'm not exactly sure how they would even rework it. Maybe make the buff purgeable or something. Fundamentally, it's more of an issue of like there's no real counterplay to bolstering. I actually don't even think I'd advocate for a purgeable buff, because with raging, whenever you play raging, I actually don't think raging is that great either. I think that the counterplay from raging of bringing an evoker is, I don't think, acceptable personally. But just kind of really focusing on bolstering, they have similar issues where the way you're doing the pack is like it gets a bit tricky whenever raging activates, and some mobs just aren't really well designed with how bolstering currently functions, right? Where the berserkers also just like start one-shotting you if they have 2 or 3 stacks of the of bolstering, when in reality it probably shouldn't be like that. I also just don't think it's like a very fun experience for most players. I know it isn't personally a very fun experience. Um, I think it's probably one that could be certainly modernized, and I think that Blizzard has been doing a pretty good job. And I don't think this is something that they're going to change in the middle of a patch. But I do think it's probably something that needs to be looked at moving forward. And I think again, this is certainly compounded by the fact that this season's dungeons are very, very, very bad for bolstering. So it is very apparent whenever you're playing these dungeons that bolstering is active. But that's not something that I necessarily think that like the Blizzard developers, whenever they're designing dungeons, Blizzard developers should be looking at focusing on making fun dungeons for players. They shouldn't necessarily be focused on how do we make this dungeon work with bolstering, right? I think that their first and foremost priority should be making fun dungeons, and their second or tertiary priority should be worrying about the very small and minute interactions with affixes, because I think that if they have to focus on the interactions with affixes, that's going to leave them in a really weird spot where overall I think that they just like shouldn't necessarily be in. Anyways, those are my thoughts on bolstering. I think overall they've done a good job of nerfing it over time. Like they've done the things that the community has asked for in regards to bolstering. And I'm not one of these like affix doomers that is like, oh my god, affixes, they just gotta go. But at the same point, I think that bolstering is probably something that's getting ready for retirement. It's been around for a while too. I think that it's seen a lot of Mythic Plus, and I'm ready to see it go. Anyways, that's gonna be it for me today. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. It's just a kind of an interesting thought experiment. It's an opinion piece video. I'm interested in hearing what your thoughts are down in the comment section below as I get farmed by the berserkers one last time. Goodbye.